I, 32M, have a twin brother, Archie. Not identical, and trust me, my parents never let anyone forget which one they considered the upgrade. Our whole lives, Archie was the golden child. Not because he was smarter or worked harder, it was because Archie looked like our dad, Winston, talked like him, same mannerism, same everything. I took after our mom, Deborah's side, which was apparently some cosmic insult to Winston. Deborah just followed his lead because that's what Deborah does. Growing up, every milestone was a competition Winston manufactured. Archie's grades got framed, mine got reviewed for what I could improve. Archie got a car at 17, a used Mazda 3. Winston spent a weekend detailing. I got told the bus would teach me independence. When I got accepted into a better college than Archie, Winston said book smarts don't mean anything in the real world. Every event was filtered through Archie being the standard and me being the cautionary tale. I married Isabel at 26, lasted 3 years. She left because I was not in a good place mentally, and I brought that baggage into the marriage. I'm not going to pretend I was perfect. We divorced, no kids, clean split. I moved 4 hours away, got into commercial property management, and spent 3 years building myself from nothing. Here's what nobody knew. I bought property, multiple units. 18-hour days, aggressive saving, networking with every landlord I could find, built a portfolio generating serious rental income, and bought a 4-bedroom house outright. Meanwhile, back home, Winston's contracting work had dried up. Deborah's part-time job barely covered groceries, and Archie had moved back in with them at 29 because his finances were a mess. None of them knew because I stopped sharing. After the divorce, I showed up maybe twice a year, said little, left early. They assumed I was struggling. They assumed wrong. The dinner, late October, about 7 months ago. Deborah called about a family gathering for Archie's birthday. I almost didn't go. I drove 4 hours. The whole family was there. Winston's brother, Charles, and his wife, cousins, Archie's kids from a previous relationship, 8 and 10, Deborah's friends and Holly, Archie's girlfriend. Evening started normally. Food was decent. I stayed in the background. Then Archie announced he and Holly were engaged. Everyone clapped. I said congratulations, meant it. Whatever issues I have with my family, I never wanted Archie to fail. But Winston couldn't let a moment exist without making it a weapon. He stood up with his drink, went on about how proud he was of Archie, then looked directly at me and said, "Finally, one son isn't a complete disappointment. Unlike this pathetic excuse who can't even keep a wife." He pointed at me at the table in front of everyone. Then Deborah said they should have selected just one embryo because they always knew which one would be the failure. Casually, like commenting on the weather. Charles laughed. Holly laughed. The kids started laughing because the adults were. Archie sat there and said nothing. I looked at every face around that table. I smiled. Not because it was funny, but because I made a decision right there about what happens next. I grabbed my jacket and said I had an early morning. 4 hours driving home in silence. No music, just planning. Because here's what none of them knew. Winston and Deborah's house, the one where they just humiliated me, they didn't own it. They'd sold it 3 years prior to cover Winston's debts and were running it back through a property management company. That company had been acquired 8 months before the dinner by the firm I work for. I found my parents' address in the system completely by accident reviewing new portfolio properties from the acquisition. I hadn't touched that information, but after Winston called me pathetic and Deborah wished I'd never been born in front of children, I decided it was time to use every advantage I had. And I need to tell you what Charles did the week after that dinner because that's when everything got complicated. But this is long enough. Update coming. 32 years. 32 years of being treated like an error message that popped up on the family screen. And Winston's big flex is pointing at his son at a dinner table like he's presenting Exhibit A in a court case nobody asked for. And Deborah said that with the energy of someone saying pass the salt. She didn't even pause. She didn't even register that she was telling a human being, her human being, that he was a manufacturing defect in front of 8 and 10-year-olds who are now learning that this is how you treat people you're supposed to love. And look, I got to address the elephant. This man is sitting on a real estate portfolio, owns his house outright, And these people are renting their own home back from a company he works for, and they're over here calling him the failure? Winston is out here cosplaying success while literally living in a house he had to sell because he couldn't manage his own finances. That is a level of delusion that deserves to be studied. You are in debt, sir. Your son moved back in with you at 29. Your lights are on because of a part-time job and whatever prayers Deborah's got left, and you stood up at that table with a drink in your hand, probably bought with late rent money, and called your other son pathetic? Winston doesn't have audacity, he has a disorder. But honestly, what gets me is the 4-hour drive home in silence. No music? That's not sadness, that's a man doing math. That silence was an entire war room being assembled in real time. And the fact that he already knew about the house, had known for months, and never touched it? That's restraint most people don't have. He was willing to let it go. They made him unwilling. Update 1. Alright, guys, a lot of you asked about Charles, so let me get into it because this is where things started branching out in ways I didn't expect. The Monday after the dinner, Charles texted me. Now, Charles is Winston's older brother, and he's always been Winston's hype man. Always backing him up, always co-signing whatever garbage Winston says. At the dinner, he was laughing right along with everyone else. So, when I saw his name on my phone, I already knew this wasn't going to be an apology. And I was right. Charles wanted to talk about Archie's wedding. Specifically, he wanted to know if I was planning to cause problems because apparently after I left the dinner, Winston told everyone that I was jealous of Archie and that's why I walked out. Not because Winston publicly called me a pathetic failure in front of children. No, because I was jealous. And Charles bought it completely. He sent me this long message about how the family doesn't need drama at the wedding, how I should be happy for my brother, how I need to stop making everything about myself. I read it 3 times. Then I asked Charles one question. Did he actually believe what Winston said at that table was acceptable? And Charles said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that Winston was just being honest and that maybe if I tried harder in life, I wouldn't be so sensitive about hearing the truth. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't just Winston being Winston. The entire family had built a story around me being the problem. Not Winston for saying it, not Deborah for the embryo comment, not any of them for laughing. Me for having the audacity to be bothered by it. That realization changed my approach to everything. I didn't respond to Charles after that, but I started doing something I'd been putting off. I pulled up my parents' rental file at work. Not to mess with it, not yet. I just wanted to understand their full situation. And guys, it was bad. They were 2 months behind on rent. There were 3 maintenance requests that had been ignored by the previous management company before we acquired the portfolio. The lease was month to month because they couldn't commit to a year-long term. Winston and Deborah were barely hanging on and nobody in the family was talking about it because Winston's pride wouldn't allow it. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Around mid-November, about 3 weeks after the dinner, Archie called me. First time he'd called me directly in over a year. He wanted to ask me to be his best man. Let that sink in for a second. The guy who sat there silently while our father called me a pathetic failure and our mother wished I'd never been born now wanted me standing next to him at his wedding. And his reasoning was wild. He told me that despite everything, we're twins and it wouldn't look right if I wasn't up there. It wouldn't look right. Not that he wanted me there. Not that he valued me. But that the optics would be off. I told Archie I needed to think about it. But what I was actually thinking about was timing. Because I'd been going through the acquisition files and I discovered something else about the property portfolio. 3 of the rental units in the same neighborhood as my parents' house were occupied by tenants connected to Winston's old contracting network. Guys who used to work for him. Guys who owed him favors. These were the same people who'd been feeding Winston's side jobs under the table to keep him afloat. And all of their leases were coming up for renewal in January. I wasn't making any moves yet. I was mapping the board. Meanwhile, Holly started a group chat for the wedding planning and added me to it. And through that group chat I learned something that made the whole situation 10 times more interesting. Winston and Deborah were supposed to be hosting the wedding reception at their house. The house they were renting. The house they were behind on rent for. The house that was now in my firm's portfolio. Holly was talking about tent rentals, catering quotes. All of it planned around my parents' backyard. Archie and Holly clearly couldn't afford a venue. And Winston had volunteered his place to maintain the image that everything was fine. Deborah messaged me separately through that group chat around Thanksgiving. She didn't apologize for the embryo comment. Instead, she asked if I could contribute financially to the wedding because, and this is a direct quote from her message, "Archie deserves a beautiful day and we all need to do our part." I screenshot that message and saved it. Not because I needed evidence of anything. Because I wanted to remember exactly how it felt to be told I should pay for a celebration by the woman who said I shouldn't exist. So by December, I had a pretty clear picture. My parents were financially dependent on a rental property managed by my firm. Archie's entire wedding was being built around that same property. Charles was actively working to isolate me from the family. And everyone expected me to show up, smile, pay my share, and be grateful for the privilege of standing next to the brother they'd always preferred. I started making calls, not to my family, to my contacts in the property business. I needed to understand exactly what options I had as someone with direct oversight of this portfolio. What was within policy, what required approval, and what the timeline looked like for lease non-renewals in the new year. Everything by the book, everything legal, but everything pointed in one direction. Then in mid-December, something happened that I genuinely didn't plan for, and it changed my entire strategy. But I'll get into that in the next update because I need to figure out how much I can say about it. The scapegoat economy in this family is fascinating to me because it's not just Winston anymore. It's a whole system. Charles is enforcement. Deborah is logistics. Archie is the product they're all protecting. And OP? OP is the designated emotional landfill where everybody dumps their garbage and then gets mad when the landfill starts smelling. Charles texting him about causing problems is so revealing because it tells you everything about how this family processes conflict. The person who reacts to abuse is the problem, never the person who commits it. Winston could light the house on fire, and they'd blame OP for not bringing a bucket. And Archie wanting him as best man for optics? That is genuinely one of the most dehumanizing things I've heard in a while. He's not asking for a brother. He's requesting a prop. Stand here, smile here, hold this ring, complete the pictures so nobody asks uncomfortable questions. Archie has never seen OP as a person with feelings. He sees him as a set piece that occasionally malfunctions by having emotions. But here's where I start getting nervous for OP because I can see him lining up dominoes across like a 12-block radius. He's got the house, the contractors, the lease timelines, the wedding date, and he is quiet. This man is operating like a chess engine that's already calculated 15 moves ahead while everyone else thinks they're playing checkers. The thing that makes this scary is he's not even bending rules. Everything is within policy, everything is legal, everything would happen to any tenant in this situation. His parents just happened to be that tenant, and they put themselves there by treating the one person who could help them like he was disposable. We all need to do our part. Deborah, you told this man he shouldn't have been born, and now you want him to chip in for centerpieces. The entitlement is so thick you could insulate a house with it. Update 2. Okay, so the mid-December thing. A lot of you guessed it had to do with the lease, and you're partially right, but it's way messier than that. My firm does quarterly portfolio reviews in December. Every property gets evaluated for profitability, maintenance costs, tenant payment history. Properties that aren't performing get flagged for rent adjustments, lease changes, or non-renewal notices. I didn't create this process, but I had input on which properties in my region got flagged. My parents' property got flagged automatically. 2 months behind, late payment history going back over a year. My supervisor pulled me into a meeting about underperforming properties, and their address was on the list with 15 others. He asked for recommendations. I gave honest assessments across the board. When we got to their address, I said the same thing I said about every chronically late tenant. Month-to-month lease with consistent payment issues is a liability. Recommend a formal notice with a deadline to catch up or vacate. I didn't tell my supervisor it was my parents' house. These people made it clear I wasn't family. Then they don't get family treatment. Notices went out first week of January. Standard 30-day letters. My parents got one. So did the 3 guys from Winston's contracting network in the same neighborhood. Now, here's where Charles makes everything worse. Turns out Charles had been co-signing Winston's equipment leases for contracting work. When Winston's business dried up, those leases didn't disappear. Charles was covering payments for 2 years because Winston kept promising he'd get back on his feet. Charles had his own financial pressure and had been counting on the wedding going smoothly so he could confront Winston about the debt afterward without blowing up the family. I found this out because Deborah called me in early January to complain. Not about the 30-day notice, to vent about how Charles's wife was being difficult about money and everyone was pressuring Winston. She went on for 20 minutes about how unfair it was that people expected Winston to handle everything. Not a single word about the dinner, not a single word about what she said to me. She called me to be her emotional support while never acknowledging she told me I shouldn't have been born. I let her talk, asked questions, gathered information Charles and Winston's equipment situation, how tight money was, how Archie and Holly were fighting about wedding costs because Holly's family wasn't contributing and Archie had no savings. Deborah handed me all of this freely because in her mind I was still the quiet son who listens. By mid-January, pressure was building from everywhere. Winston got the notice and started calling around trying to figure out who owned the property. The acquisition had changed the management structure and everything went through a central office. He was leaving voicemails with a general line getting callbacks from people who had no clue who he was. Archie and Holly had non-refundable deposits on catering and tent rental for the April backyard reception, and Charles was getting aggressive with Winston about equipment payments because his wife was threatening to leave. End of January, Archie texted about best man again. Needed an answer. This time he added something. Could I help cover the rehearsal dinner because Winston offered to pay but now couldn't? He typed the words, I know we haven't always been close but you're doing well and family steps up. Family steps up. The family that laughed when our father called me a failure. The family that agreed I shouldn't exist. Now they want me to step up. I told Archie yes. Yes to best man. Yes to the rehearsal dinner. Told him I was all in and I meant every word, just not the way he thought. By February, I had a clear plan. The lease, the wedding timeline, Charles's debt, Archie's dependence on Winston, Holly's non-refundable deposits, all converging on one date in April, and I was going to be standing right in the middle when it all came together. But then Winston found out who managed the property, and what he did next is something I still can't wrap my head around. These people made it clear I wasn't family. Then they don't get family treatment. That line right there is the entire thesis of this story, and it is airtight. Because that's the thing about family. You don't get to weaponize the title when it's convenient, and then hide behind it when you need something. You can't tell someone they're a disappointment, a failure, an embryo that should have been discarded, and then turn around 3 months later and say, family steps up. You opted out of family when you made that man drive 4 hours home in silence, questioning whether he should have been born. You don't get to opt back in when the rent is due. And Deborah calling OP to vent about financial stress while never mentioning the thing she said, that's not forgetfulness. That's a person who genuinely doesn't think what she did was wrong. In her mind, that comment left her mouth and evaporated. It doesn't exist. She called her son, the one she publicly wished away, to use him as a free therapist because he's always been the quiet one who listens. She's been using him as emotional furniture his entire life, something you lean on, but never actually look at. And I love how everyone in this family is financially underwater, but they're all pretending everything is fine. Winston volunteering his rented house for a reception he can't afford, Archie putting down non-refundable deposits with no savings, Charles co-signing leases for a brother who can't pay him back. And the man Winston said was a complete disappointment, he's doing just fine. That's the whole story. The man he raised me to be would have helped them. But the man he turned me into wouldn't. I need everybody to sit with that for a second because that is not a comeback. That is not a mic drop written for the internet. That is a man returning 32 years of damage to its rightful owner and saying, here, this is your product. You built this. You spent 3 decades pouring cruelty into a child, and now you're standing on the porch of the house that cruelty built asking the man you broke to fix you, and he's saying no. Not because he can't, because you taught him not to. And Winston's explanation at the end, I saw Deborah's father in you. Oh, so you emotionally abused your child because he reminded you of a man you didn't like. You punished a kid for having the wrong face. You looked at your own son every day, and instead of seeing your son, you saw a grudge. And you think that explanation is going to land as an apology? That's not an apology, Winston. That's a confession. You just admitted you never even saw him. Not once in 32 years did you look at that boy and see him. And I want to be real about something. Is Opie a saint in this story? He had a conflict of interest. He didn't disclose at work. He gathered intel from his own mother like she was an asset he was developing. He said yes to being best man knowing full well what was coming. There is a coldness to this that I'm not going to pretend is purely heroic. But, and this is a big but, every single thing that happened to Winston and Deborah would have happened without Opie. They were behind on rent before the dinner. The properties were getting flagged before he ever pulled up their file. The contractors couldn't pay before Opie mapped the board. All Opie really did was decide not to be the safety net they never deserved. He didn't push them off a cliff. He just stopped standing at the bottom trying to catch them. Archie is honestly the saddest part of this whole thing to me because Archie had so many chances. He had chances at the dinner, after the dinner, when Charles texted, when he asked Opie to be best man, when he found out about the property. Every single time, he chose the path that protected his comfort. He never once chose his brother. And that March phone call where he finally said, "I understand you were hurt." That wasn't growth. That was desperation wearing an empathy costume. He didn't suddenly develop a conscience. He developed a venue problem. The family that told Opie he was nothing is now living in a 2-bedroom apartment while Opie is sitting in a 4-bedroom house he owns outright. And I know people are going to say, revenge doesn't heal you. And sure, maybe. But you know what also doesn't heal you? Being told you shouldn't exist and then showing up to hold the ring at your brother's wedding with a smile. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is leave the table where they never set a place for you and go build your own house, literally. Winston spent 32 years manufacturing a disappointment. Turns out the only thing he manufactured was his own downfall. And the bus he told his son to ride, it left without him. Thank you for watching Hidden Lies, where every story hides a secret, and every secret changes everything. If you enjoyed this journey into darkness and emotion, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more unforgettable stories.